Picture a human from 50,000 years ago. Now picture yourself. Strip away the clothes, the haircut, the modern diet. Stand them side by side. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You'd barely be able to tell them apart. Same height, same bone structure, same brain size, same hands and feet. That person could walk down a city street today and nobody would look twice. Maybe they'd notice something slightly different about the brow ridge or the jaw, but mostly, they'd look like us. Now think about your smartphone, the device you're probably watching this on right now. 5 years ago, it didn't exist in its current form. 10 years ago, the technology inside it was science fiction. 50 years ago, the idea of holding the entire sum of human knowledge in your pocket would have seemed like magic. Our technology has evolved at an exponential rate, doubling in power and sophistication every few years, but our bodies, our actual physical form, frozen in time for 50,000 years. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments, and it's wild. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out, all watching the same moment. This is one of the most profound mysteries in human evolution, and almost nobody talks about it. We know evolution works. We can see it happening in other species. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics in months. Birds develop different beak shapes within decades. Insects adapt to pesticides within years. Evolution is constant, relentless, never-ending. Except, apparently, when it comes to modern humans. Around 50,000 years ago, something strange happened. Or more accurately, something stopped happening. For millions of years before that moment, human ancestors had been changing dramatically. 4 million years ago, we were barely different from other apes. Small-brained, mostly tree-dwelling, nothing special. Then evolution kicked into high gear. Our brains tripled in size. We lost our body hair. We developed the ability to walk upright efficiently. Our hands became precision instruments capable of creating complex tools. Our vocal anatomy changed to allow sophisticated speech. Change after change after change, relatively rapid by evolutionary standards. And then, suddenly, the changes stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. The last major physical transformation happened around 50,000 years ago when anatomically modern humans emerged. Since then, almost nothing. We've spread to every continent. We've adapted to deserts, tundra, rainforests, mountains, islands. We've survived ice ages and heat waves. We've gone from small bands of hunter-gatherers to civilizations of billions. And through all of that, through 50,000 years of radical environmental change, our bodies have remained essentially identical. That shouldn't be possible. It violates everything we know about how evolution works. When species spread to new environments, they diversify, they adapt, they change. Darwin's finches develop different beaks on different islands within thousands of years. Why haven't humans on different continents evolved into obviously different forms? Why can a person from Norway and a person from Nigeria still interbreed and produce healthy children? Why are we all still so remarkably, unmistakably the same species? The answer to this mystery involves a perfect storm of factors that came together at one specific moment in prehistory. A population bottleneck that nearly destroyed us. A technological revolution that changed the rules of survival. A brain that became so powerful it made further physical evolution unnecessary. And a pattern of migration and mixing that prevented us from ever staying isolated long enough to become something new. What happened 50,000 years ago didn't just change human history. It ended human evolution as we'd known it for millions of years. We became the species that evolved to stop evolving, and the reasons why are far more fascinating and strange than you might imagine. This is the story of our frozen evolution, and it starts with understanding what we looked like when the changes finally stopped. So here's where we need to talk about what actually makes a human modern. Because when scientists say anatomically modern humans, they're not talking about someone who shops at Whole Foods and uses a smartphone. They're talking about a very specific set of physical features that emerged somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago in Africa. Features that, remarkably, haven't changed much since. Look in a mirror. The face staring back at you would be instantly recognizable to someone who lived 250,000 years ago. Sure, they'd be confused by your clothes and probably terrified by your car, but your body would look completely familiar. That's how stable our anatomy has been. But it wasn't always this way. Your ancestors from 500,000 years ago looked different. Not wildly different. Not like a completely separate species, but different enough that you'd notice immediately if you saw one walking down the street. They had the kind of differences that matter. The most obvious change was the skull. Early humans, the ones living before 300,000 years ago, had what anthropologists call robust features. Think heavy brow ridges jutting out over the eyes like permanent frown lines made of bone. Think thick skull walls, massive jaw muscles, faces that projected forward in a kind of permanent snout. These weren't ugly people. They were just built differently, optimized for a different kind of life. Then something changed. Somewhere in Africa, probably in multiple places around the same time, a new skull shape began appearing in the fossil record. The brow ridges started shrinking. The forehead became vertical instead of sloping backward. The face flattened, becoming less prognathous, which is a fancy way of saying the jaw stopped jutting forward so much. Most distinctive of all was the appearance of a chin. Look at a Neanderthal skull. Look at Homo erectus. Look at any earlier human species. No chin. The jaw just slopes backward from the teeth. But modern humans, we've got this weird little shelf of bone sticking out at the bottom of our face. Nobody's entirely sure why we evolved chins, but they show up right around the time anatomically modern humans appear, and they've been with us ever since. The rest of the skeleton changed too. Earlier humans were built like tanks, thick bones, massive muscle attachments, bodies designed for raw physical power. The kind of build you'd need if you're regularly wrestling with large animals and surviving without any technology more advanced than a sharp rock. But anatomically, modern humans went in a different direction. Our bones became gracile, which is the scientific term for delicate, slender, built more for efficiency than raw strength. Our rib cages narrowed, our pelvises changed shape, our limbs became longer relative to our torso, a body plan that's excellent for long-distance travel but terrible for generating raw power. We became distance specialists, not the strongest human species, not the most robust, but definitely the best at travelling long distances efficiently. You could drop a modern human and a Neanderthal in a competition to move a boulder. The Neanderthal wins every time. But make it a marathon, we win. And in a world where resources are scattered and unpredictable, the ability to travel far and efficiently matters more than the ability to move heavy objects. But the really important changes, the ones that made us who we are, weren't visible from the outside. They were happening inside the skull. The human brain had been getting bigger for millions of years. Homo erectus had brains around 900 cubic centimeters. Heidelbergensis, one of our later ancestors, had brains averaging 1,200 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals actually had slightly larger brains than modern humans, averaging around 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. But somewhere between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, brain size stopped being the thing that mattered. What started mattering was brain organization, the shape of the brain, the connections between different regions, the ratio of different structures. Modern human brains are rounder than those of earlier humans. We have higher, more bulging foreheads that accommodate expanded frontal lobes. These are the regions associated with planning, abstract reasoning, social cognition, and impulse control. The mental toolkit you need not for raw survival, but for navigating complex social environments. We also developed expanded temporal lobes, the regions involved in language processing and memory. And our cerebellums, the structures involved in fine motor control, grew proportionally larger. This might not sound dramatic, but it's the difference between being able to chip a rock into a crude cutting tool and being able to manufacture a precisely symmetrical spear point with a dozen different specialized cutting techniques. Around the same time, our vocal anatomy was changing. Earlier humans had vocal tracts that were high in the throat, similar to modern apes. This is great if you want to drink and breathe at the same time, a handy feature that prevents choking, but it severely limits the range of sounds you can produce. Modern humans have vocal tracts that descend much lower in the throat. This makes us more vulnerable to choking. Swallowing the wrong way can actually kill us, but it gives us an enormous range of potential sounds. We can produce dozens of distinct consonants and vowels, the raw material needed for complex spoken language. The genetic evidence suggests this change happened relatively recently, probably within the last 100,000 years. There's a gene called FOXP2 that's involved in the development of vocal learning and fine motor control of the face and tongue. Modern humans have a variant of this gene that's different from the version found in other primates. Neanderthals had the same variant, suggesting they probably had sophisticated vocal abilities too. But earlier humans didn't. This is where things get really interesting, because all these changes, the skull shape, the gracile skeleton, the reorganized brain, the descended larynx, they all came together somewhere between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago. But for most of that time, nothing much happened behaviorally. The archaeological record from 250,000 years ago shows anatomically modern humans living basically the same way their ancestors had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, making simple stone tools, probably hunting and gathering, leaving very little evidence of symbolic thinking or complex culture. Then, around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, everything exploded. Archaeologists call it the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Some prefer the term cognitive revolution or behavioral modernity. Whatever you call it, it marks the moment when humans started acting like us. Suddenly the archaeological record fills with evidence of symbolic thinking. Cave paintings appearing across Africa and Europe, deliberately carved figurines, jewelry made from shells and animal teeth, sophisticated multi-component tools requiring dozens of steps to manufacture, long-distance trade networks moving raw materials hundreds of miles. Most tellingly, burial practices become elaborate, not just putting bodies in the ground, but deliberate positioning, inclusion of grave goods, evidence of ritual. This is the signature of people who can think symbolically, who can conceive of abstract concepts like an afterlife or the social identity of the deceased. What happened? How did anatomically modern humans exist for 200,000 years without showing much behavioral sophistication, then suddenly explode into full cultural modernity? The most likely answer is that the physical changes came first, setting the stage. But the final neural wiring, the last critical connections in the brain that enabled fully modern cognition, took longer to evolve. Think of it like building a computer. You might have all the hardware in place, the processor, the memory, the display, but until you install the right operating system, it's just an expensive paperweight. The anatomical changes between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago were the hardware upgrades. The cognitive revolution around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago was the operating system coming online. Genetic evidence supports this timeline. Studies of ancient DNA from early modern humans show that certain genes associated with brain development and synaptic plasticity, the ability of neurons to form new connections, was still undergoing rapid evolution as recently as 40,000 years ago. The wiring was being finalized even as the basic structure had been set hundreds of thousands of years earlier. This is also when we see the final physical distinctions between modern humans and our closest relatives becoming fixed. Neanderthals and Denisovans, remember, split from our lineage around 800,000 years ago after the bottleneck. For hundreds of thousands of years they were evolving in parallel, adapting to different environments, developing different survival strategies. By 50,000 years ago the physical differences were clear. Neanderthals were shorter, more robust, with barrel chests adapted for cold climates and massive nasal passages for warming frozen air. Their brains were slightly larger but shaped differently, more elongated, with less expansion in the frontal and temporal regions. Denisovans we know less about because we have fewer fossils, but genetic analysis suggests they were also robustly built, possibly even more so than Neanderthals. They had unique adaptations for high-altitude living and possibly for maritime environments. Modern humans, meanwhile, had become the generalists, not optimized for any particular environment, but adaptable to almost anything. Our gracile builds meant we weren't as strong as Neanderthals in hand-to-hand combat, but we could travel farther with less energy expenditure. Our vocal anatomy meant we could communicate more precisely, coordinating larger groups and sharing complex information. Most importantly, our brain organization meant we could innovate faster, developing new technologies and social strategies to deal with changing conditions. We weren't necessarily smarter than Neanderthals in raw cognitive power, but we were more flexible, more creative, better at accumulating and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. And here's the crucial thing. By around 50,000 years ago, these features had stabilized. The fossil record after this point shows remarkably little change in human anatomy. Sure, there's variation between populations, skin color adapting to different latitudes, body proportions changing in response to local climates, but the basic blueprint had been set. The human body had reached what engineers call an optimal design. Not perfect, we've got plenty of design flaws, but optimal in the sense that any major change would make things worse rather than better. Our anatomy had become good enough for what we needed to do, which was support increasingly complex brains and enable increasingly sophisticated social behaviors. From 50,000 years ago onward, human evolution would happen primarily in the realm of culture and behavior, not in the structure of our bodies. The hardware was complete. Everything after this would be software updates. We had become the species we still are today, physically unchanged in any fundamental way for the last 50,000 years, carrying the same basic anatomy that emerged from hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, refined in the crucible of the population bottleneck, and finalized in the cognitive revolution that made us behaviorally modern. The age of physical transformation was over. The age of cultural evolution was about to begin, and that, more than anything, is why we stopped changing physically. Because we'd found a better way to adapt. But that's the next part of the story. Picture this. You're living 74,000 years ago in what is now Indonesia. Your ancestors have been slowly evolving toward modern humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. Your species has survived ice ages, droughts, predators, and every imaginable hardship the world could throw at it. You've developed larger brains, more graceful bodies, the capacity for symbolic thought and complex language. You're on the verge of becoming the dominant species on the planet. And then Mount Toba explodes, not erupts, explodes, the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years, 6,000 times more powerful than the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption, so massive that it ejected 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. That's enough material to bury the entire state of Texas under 5 feet of volcanic debris. The explosion was heard across half the planet. The shockwave circled the globe multiple times. But the immediate devastation was nothing compared to what came next. Within hours, a blanket of ash began settling over South and Southeast Asia. In some places, it accumulated to depths of over 15 feet. Entire ecosystems were buried alive. Animals suffocated. Plants died. Rivers and lakes turned into toxic sludge. Anyone living within 1,000 miles of the eruption was almost certainly killed, either by the ashfall, the pyroclastic flows, or the tsunamis that followed. But you're one of the lucky ones. You live in Africa, thousands of miles away from the eruption. You're safe from the immediate effects, except you're not safe at all. Because the ash that buried Southeast Asia didn't just fall to the ground. Billions of tons of it were blasted into the stratosphere, where it began spreading across the entire planet. Within weeks, the sky everywhere turned a sickly grey. The sun became a dim orange disk, barely visible through the haze. Temperatures started dropping, and they kept dropping. Within months, global temperatures had fallen by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between a functioning ecosystem and ecological collapse. In the tropics, it meant the difference between regular rainfall and severe drought. At higher latitudes, it triggered what scientists call a volcanic winter. For 6 years, maybe longer, the ash stayed in the atmosphere. 6 years of crop failures, 6 years of dying grasslands, 6 years of animals starving and predators growing desperate, 6 years of humans struggling to find enough food to survive. The archaeological record from this period tells a grim story. Sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years suddenly go silent. Tool caches are abandoned, settlements are left empty. And when people do return to these places, sometimes generations later, they're different people, different cultures, different genetic lineages, because most of your people didn't make it through. The genetic evidence is stark and undeniable. When we sequence modern human genomes and look back through time, we see something remarkable around 70,000 to 75,000 years ago. A dramatic reduction in genetic diversity. All modern humans, all 7 billion of us, show signs of having descended from a tiny founder population that lived during this period. How tiny? Estimates vary, but genetic models suggest the entire breeding population of humans might have crashed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Some studies put it even lower, as few as 1,000 breeding pairs. Out of whatever population existed before Toba, maybe 100,000 people or more, Only a few thousand survived the volcanic winter and the climate disruption that followed. Think about that. 1,000 to 5,000 breeding pairs. That's the entire genetic foundation of modern humanity. Every physical trait you see in humans today, every variation in skin color, height, facial features, all of it descends from the genes carried by those few thousand survivors. This is what geneticists call a population bottleneck, and it's one of the most important events in human evolutionary history, because bottlenecks don't just reduce population size, they fundamentally alter how evolution works in a species. Here's why. In a large population, genetic diversity is maintained through constant mixing. You've got millions of genetic variants floating around, and evolution can experiment with different combinations. Natural selection can fine-tune traits over time. Beneficial mutations spread slowly. Harmful ones get filtered out. Physical changes accumulate gradually. But in a small population, everything changes. Rare genetic variants that might have been lost in a larger population get preserved just by chance. Harmful mutations that would normally be eliminated stick around because there's nobody else to mate with. And most importantly, the range of possible genetic combinations shrinks dramatically. It's like having a deck of cards. With a full deck, you can play hundreds of different games, create endless combinations. But if you suddenly reduce that deck to just 20 cards, your options become severely limited. You're working with a fraction of the original possibilities. That's what happened to human genetics after Toba. The survivors carried only a subset of the genetic diversity that existed before the eruption. And all the physical variation that had existed in pre-Toba humans, all the different body types and facial structures and metabolic adaptations, suddenly got narrowed down to whatever happened to be present in those few thousand survivors. This is called the founder effect. The survivors weren't necessarily the fittest, or the strongest, or the smartest. They were just the lucky ones who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Maybe they lived in a region where the climate impacts were less severe. Maybe they had access to a reliable water source. Maybe they just got lucky and found enough food to survive while others starved. But whatever traits they carried, those became the foundation of all future human evolution. Every human born after the bottleneck inherited their genes. Every physical characteristic of modern humans traces back to whatever happened to be present in that survivor population. And here's the crucial part. Once you've gone through a bottleneck, this severe, major evolutionary change becomes extremely difficult. Because evolution needs raw material to work with, it needs genetic diversity. Without it, natural selection has nothing to select. You can't evolve blue skin if nobody in your population carries the genes for blue pigmentation. You can't develop resistance to a new disease if nobody has the mutation that provides immunity. The Toba bottleneck essentially froze human physical evolution in its current configuration. Whatever we looked like after emerging from that crisis, that's more or less what we still look like today. Not because evolution stopped, but because the genetic toolkit for major physical changes had been drastically reduced. And the timing is remarkable. Modern humans, anatomically speaking, emerged around 200,000 years ago in Africa. For over 100,000 years, we continued evolving, developing the physical traits that distinguish us from archaic humans. Smaller brow ridges, higher foreheads, more prominent chins, lighter skeletal structure. Then Toba hits, 74,000 years ago, right at the point when these modern features had become fully established but before humans had spread out across the globe in large numbers. The bottleneck locked in the modern human body plan just as it was reaching its current form. But it gets even more interesting, Because Toba wasn't the only bottleneck event humans experienced. The genetic evidence suggests there were multiple periods of population collapse during the Ice Age, each one reinforcing the effects of the previous crisis. Between 70,000 and 10,000 years ago, the planet underwent repeated cycles of cooling and warming. Glacial periods lasted tens of thousands of years, making vast regions of the Earth uninhabitable. During the coldest phases, ice sheets covered northern Europe and North America down to latitudes where major cities now stand. Sea levels dropped by over 400 feet, exposing new land bridges but also disrupting coastal ecosystems. Each climate swing would have caused human populations to contract and expand. During cold phases, people retreated to refuges, small areas with reliable resources. Populations became isolated from each other. Some groups went extinct entirely. Others barely held on with just a few hundred individuals. Then when the climate warmed again, the survivors would expand, recolonizing empty territories. But each cycle reduced genetic diversity a little more. Each bottleneck filtered the human genome, removing variants that didn't happen to be present in the survivors. It's like running water through a series of increasingly fine filters. Each pass removes more of the impurities, but it also removes more of the variation. By the time you're done, what comes out is extremely pure, but also extremely uniform. That's what happened to human genetics over the course of the Ice Age. Multiple bottlenecks, each one reducing diversity, each one making major evolutionary change less and less likely. The human genome became increasingly homogeneous. Not identical. There was still plenty of variation in superficial traits like skin color and facial features, but the fundamental body plan became fixed. And this shows up in our DNA today in remarkable ways. Modern humans have less genetic diversity than almost any other widespread mammal species. Chimpanzees, despite having far smaller populations confined to Central Africa, have more genetic variation than all of humanity combined. The same is true for gorillas, orangutans, and most other primate species. We are, genetically speaking, one of the most uniform species on the planet. Despite our apparent physical diversity, despite living on every continent and adapting to every imaginable environment, humans are all remarkably similar at the genetic level. In fact, any two humans chosen at random will share about 99% of their DNA sequence. The remaining 0% accounts for all human genetic variation, every difference in height, skin color, facial features, disease resistance, everything that makes you physically different from someone on the other side of the planet. It all comes down to variations in less than 0.1% of your genome. This is the signature of the bottleneck. This is what near extinction does to a species. It strips away the genetic diversity that allows for major evolutionary change and leaves behind a core population that's fundamentally homogeneous. But here's what makes humans unique. We didn't respond to this genetic constraint by stagnating. We didn't become an evolutionary dead end, locked into a body plan that couldn't adapt to new challenges. Instead, we developed a different kind of evolution. One that didn't require genetic change at all. One that could happen thousands of times faster than biological evolution. One that could spread beneficial adaptations across entire populations within a single generation. We evolved culture, and that changed everything. Because once culture became our primary means of adaptation, once we learned to modify our environment instead of waiting for our bodies to adapt to it, the rules of evolution no longer applied in the same way. We could live in the Arctic without evolving thick fur. We could thrive in deserts without developing specialized kidneys. We could colonize every ecosystem on Earth without changing our physical form at all. The bottleneck had locked our bodies in place, but it had also created selection pressure for the one trait that would allow us to transcend those physical limitations: intelligence, problem-solving ability, the capacity to learn, innovate, and share knowledge across generations. The survivors of Toba weren't just the lucky ones, they were the smart ones, the creative ones, the ones who could figure out how to find food when the ecosystem collapsed, the ones who could develop new hunting techniques when familiar prey disappeared, the ones who could maintain social cooperation when resources became scarce. And they passed those traits on, not just genetically, but culturally, teaching their children not just how to survive, but how to think, how to adapt, how to overcome challenges through innovation, rather than waiting for evolution to provide a solution. The population bottleneck didn't just freeze our physical evolution, it set the stage for something far more powerful: the age when humans would stop changing physically and start changing everything else instead. Something extraordinary happened about 200,000 years ago, something that had never occurred in the history of life on Earth. A species figured out how to stop evolving physically while continuing to evolve in every other way that mattered. That species was us. For 3.8 billion years, life had played by the same basic rules. You adapt to your environment through genetic changes, or you die. Cold climate, evolution gives you thick fur. Hot climate, you get less body hair and better sweating, need to catch prey. Natural selection builds you stronger jaws, sharper claws, faster legs. The environment dictates what you become, and biology does the heavy lifting. Then humans broke the pattern. We figured out something that would revolutionize not just our own survival, but the entire concept of evolution itself. We discovered that we didn't need to wait for our genes to solve problems. We could solve them ourselves right now in a single generation, using something completely external to our bodies: culture. Now, when anthropologists talk about culture, they don't mean art galleries and symphony orchestras. They mean something much more fundamental. Culture is information that spreads through learning rather than genetics. It's the accumulated knowledge of how to survive, passed from one generation to the next, not through DNA, but through teaching, observation, and innovation. And somewhere around 200,000 years ago, human culture became powerful enough to replace biological evolution as our primary survival strategy. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It built up gradually, innovation by innovation, each cultural advance reducing the selective pressure for some physical adaptation. But once it started, it created a feedback loop that would ultimately freeze our physical evolution in place. Let's start with the most obvious example: clothing. Your ancestors, the ones who survived the population bottleneck we talked about earlier, they were living in a world that was brutally unpredictable. Some regions baking hot, others freezing cold. Traditional evolution would handle this through physical adaptation. Populations in cold regions would develop shorter limbs to reduce heat loss, bulkier bodies to retain warmth, maybe thicker body hair. Populations in hot regions would become taller and leaner to maximize heat dissipation, with less body hair to improve cooling. And that's exactly what started happening. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human populations were beginning to show regional physical variations based on climate. But then someone invented clothing. We don't know exactly when. Animal skins and plant fibers don't preserve well. But genetic evidence from clothing lice, which evolved from head lice when humans started wearing animal hides, suggests we've been using clothing for at least 170,000 years, possibly much longer. This changed everything. Suddenly, a human from the tropics could walk into a subarctic environment and survive, not by waiting 10,000 generations for evolution to give them cold adaptations, but by putting on more layers. A cold-adapted human could move to the desert and survive by taking those layers off. The selective pressure for climate-specific body types instantly dropped to nearly zero. Why would natural selection bother building you a bulky, cold-adapted body when clothing did the job better, faster, and more flexibly? It wouldn't. The individuals who survived and reproduced weren't necessarily the ones with the best cold adaptations. They were the ones who made the best clothing. Physical evolution had just been outsourced to culture. Then there was fire and cooking. This might be the most important cultural innovation in human history, and definitely the one with the biggest impact on our physical evolution, or rather, the lack thereof. Cooking does something magical to food. It breaks down tough plant fibers and animal proteins, making nutrients easier to extract. It neutralizes toxins and kills parasites. It essentially outsources digestion to an external process, meaning your body doesn't have to work as hard to get energy from what you eat. Your ancestors figured this out somewhere between 400,000 and 1,000,000 years ago. And the moment they did, an enormous amount of selective pressure disappeared. Before cooking, you needed massive jaw muscles to chew tough raw meat and fibrous plants for hours each day. You needed huge molars to grind plant matter into digestible pulp. You needed an enormous digestive system to process all that raw material and extract enough calories to survive. Look at a gorilla skull sometime. See those massive sagittal crests running along the top? Those are anchor points for jaw muscles powerful enough to chew raw vegetation all day long. Early human ancestors had similar features. We were built for serious chewing. Cooking made all of that unnecessary. Cooked food is soft, pre-processed, ready to digest. You don't need a jaw that can crush bones when you can roast them until they fall apart. You don't need a digestive system the size of a refrigerator when fire has already broken down half the molecular bonds in your dinner. So natural selection stopped maintaining those expensive features. Over hundreds of thousands of years, human jaws became smaller and more gracile. Our digestive systems shrank. The energy we saved not building and operating massive chewing and digesting machinery got redirected to other systems, like our brains, which we'll talk about in the next section. But the point is this: once we could cook, there was no going back. The selective pressure for powerful digestive systems was gone forever. We had culturally evolved a solution that made biological adaptation unnecessary. Tools and weapons did the same thing for strength and natural weaponry. In the animal kingdom, if you want to be a predator, you need to be physically equipped for it. Lions have claws and powerful jaws. Eagles have talons and beaks. Wolves have speed and stamina and teeth designed to tear flesh. Humans, we're pathetic. No claws, no fangs, no venom, no armor. A chimpanzee, which weighs maybe 120 pounds, could literally tear an adult human apart. We're not built for physical confrontation, but we don't need to be, because we have spears and atlatls, and eventually bows and arrows, and traps and nets and poison and 1,000 other weapons our ancestors invented. A 90-pound human with a spear is more dangerous than a 500-pound lion. The lion has to get close, risk injury, rely entirely on its physical capabilities. The human can attack from distance, coordinate with others, set traps, plan ambushes. Once tools and weapons became sophisticated enough, the selective pressure for individual physical prowess dropped dramatically. The best hunter wasn't necessarily the strongest or fastest. He was the one with the best weapons, the best strategy, the best knowledge of animal behavior. You didn't need to evolve larger muscles. You needed to evolve a better brain that could invent more effective tools, and that's exactly what happened. But that meant physical strength itself became less critical to survival and reproduction. The arms race between predators and prey, the one that had driven so much physical evolution for hundreds of millions of years, suddenly shifted from biology to technology. Shelter construction did something similar for climate adaptations. Animals handle weather extremes through physical adaptations. Polar bears have thick fur and massive fat reserves. Desert animals have specialized kidneys that minimize water loss. Burrowing animals have powerful claws and compact bodies for digging. Humans, we build houses. The moment your ancestors figured out how to construct reliable shelters, weather became much less of a selective pressure. A well-made structure could protect you from rain, wind, temperature extremes, even predators. It created a micro-environment that you controlled, regardless of what the outside world was doing. This meant that physical adaptations for specific climates became less necessary. You didn't need to evolve thick subcutaneous fat to survive cold winters if you could build an insulated dwelling and maintain a fire inside. You didn't need specialized cooling mechanisms for hot climates if you could construct shade structures and position them to catch cooling breezes. The individuals who survived and reproduced weren't necessarily the ones with the best physical climate adaptations. They were the ones who built the best shelters. Cultural knowledge about construction techniques became more valuable than genetic adaptations for temperature tolerance. But perhaps the most important cultural innovation was cooperative hunting and food sharing. In most animal species, hunting ability is an individual trait. A lion that's fast and strong will eat well. One that's slow and weak will starve. Natural selection directly rewards physical capability. But humans developed something different. We learn to hunt in coordinated groups with different individuals, playing different roles. You didn't need to be personally capable of taking down a mammoth. You just needed to be part of a group that could do it collectively, and then we started sharing the results. Archaeological evidence from as far back as 400,000 years ago shows butchery sites where large animals were processed and the meat distributed among multiple families. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging. This was systematic sharing based on complex social rules. This changed the entire calculus of survival. Your individual hunting prowess mattered less than your ability to maintain good relationships with the group. Your physical strength mattered less than your reputation for fairness and reciprocity. Your personal capabilities mattered less than your social skills. Natural selection started favoring different traits, not bigger muscles or faster reflexes, but better social intelligence. The ability to read other people's intentions, maintain alliances, remember who owed whom, punish cheaters, reward cooperators. These are cognitive and behavioral traits, not physical ones. The evolutionary pressure shifted from body to mind, from muscle to culture, and then came language. This was the innovation that really cemented culture's victory over biology. Burr's language allowed humans to do something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. We could share complex information instantly across individuals and preserve it across generations without any genetic change whatsoever. A chimpanzee that learns a useful skill, like how to crack nuts with stones, can maybe teach it to offspring through demonstration. But the information transfer is slow, imperfect, limited. Most knowledge dies with each generation. A human with language can explain not just what to do, but why. Can describe events that happened far away or long ago. Can teach abstract concepts, share warnings about dangers never personally encountered, pass on techniques refined over generations. Suddenly, the accumulated survival knowledge of hundreds or thousands of individuals became available to everyone in the group. You didn't need to personally figure out which plants were poisonous. Someone else had learned that, probably the hard way, and the information was preserved in cultural memory. This created an exponential acceleration in cultural evolution. Each generation didn't start from zero. They inherited all the knowledge of their ancestors, added their own innovations, and passed the expanded toolkit to their children. Meanwhile, biological evolution kept chugging along at its usual glacial pace. Genetic changes take hundreds or thousands of generations to spread through a population. Cultural changes can spread in a single conversation. The race wasn't even close. Culture won, overwhelmingly. And here's where it gets really interesting. This created a self-reinforcing cycle that essentially locked our physical evolution in place. Better cultural solutions meant less selective pressure for physical adaptations. Less selective pressure meant physical evolution slowed down. But the slower our bodies evolved, the more we had to rely on cultural solutions to survive, which made us invest even more in developing better culture, which further reduced the need for physical changes. Around in circles it went, each turn of the cycle making us more dependent on culture and less dependent on physical evolution. By 50,000 years ago, this process had essentially completed. Humans had developed a cultural toolkit sophisticated enough to survive in almost any environment on Earth without significant physical changes. We had clothing for any climate, fire and cooking for any food, tools and weapons for any prey, shelters for any weather, social systems for any challenge. We had evolved ourselves out of biological evolution, the species that for millions of years had been shaped by natural selection, like every other organism on Earth had found a way to escape that ancient tyranny. We no longer had to wait for our genes to solve problems. We could solve them ourselves, immediately, using our brains and our hands and our accumulated cultural knowledge. We had become something new, a species whose evolution happened not in our DNA, but in our minds. Not in our bodies, but in our tools. Not in our genes, but in our traditions, our stories, our shared knowledge. We had become cultural beings, and from that moment on, our physical form was essentially frozen in place, a testament to what we had been when culture took over. While our minds, our societies, our technologies would continue evolving at breakneck speed, our bodies would remain stubbornly the same, and they still are, 50,000 years later. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn, because while these three human species were spreading, innovating and thriving, their bodies were making a choice that would determine everything that came after. They were trading raw physical power for something far more valuable, intelligence, and that trade came with consequences that still define us today. Your brain, right now, at this very moment, is burning through roughly 20% of your entire body's energy budget. Think about that. Your brain weighs about 3 pounds, maybe 2% of your total body weight, but it's consuming 1/5 of all the calories you eat. That's like having a sports car engine in a compact sedan. It works, but something's got to give. And here's the thing, it wasn't always this way. Go back 2 million years, and early human ancestors had brains about 1/3 the size of ours. They were still smart compared to other animals, but they weren't anywhere near modern human levels. Their brains consumed maybe 8 or 10% of their body's energy. Enough to make tools, enough to cooperate in small groups, but not enough to revolutionize the world. Then something changed. Over the course of about 1,000,000 years, human brains started growing. Fast. In evolutionary terms, this was lightning speed. By 300,000 years ago, our ancestors had brains almost as large as modern humans. By 200,000 years ago, they'd reached modern proportions. By 50,000 years ago, the expansion had stopped completely, but that growth came at a price, a massive price. Because evolution doesn't give you something for nothing. Every calorie your brain burns is a calorie that can't go somewhere else. And when your brain is demanding 20% of your total energy budget, that's a lot of calories that can't be used for other things. So what did humans give up to afford these massive energy-hungry brains? Pretty much everything else. Start with muscles. Pound for pound, humans are pathetically weak compared to other primates. A chimpanzee weighing 100 pounds can overpower a 200-pound human without breaking a sweat. Gorillas are even more ridiculous. They can lift and throw things that would crush us. The reason isn't mysterious. Their bodies invest heavily in muscle mass and bone density. Ours don't. We traded that investment for brain tissue. The same goes for speed. Humans are slow, painfully slow compared to the predators that were hunting us and the prey we were trying to hunt. A healthy adult human can maybe hit 15 or 20 miles per hour in a sprint, and only for a short distance. Meanwhile, lions run at 50 miles per hour, antelope hits 60, even pigs can outrun us. We're not built for speed because speed requires massive leg muscles, specialized fast-twitch muscle fibers, and powerful cardiovascular systems. All of that requires energy. Energy our brains were monopolizing. We also gave up our teeth. Go look at a gorilla skull or a chimpanzee jaw. Those are serious weapons. Massive canines, powerful molars, jaw muscles that could crack bones. Now look at a human skull. Our teeth are tiny, our jaws are weak. We can barely bite through tough meat without cooking it first. Why? Because maintaining large teeth and powerful jaw muscles requires significant energy investment, especially during development. That energy went to our brains instead. Our digestive system shrunk too. Most primates have huge guts capable of processing enormous amounts of tough, fibrous plant material. Humans don't. We have relatively small intestines and simple digestive systems that struggle with anything we haven't cooked or processed. This made us dependent on fire and food preparation, but it freed up energy that would have gone to maintaining a massive digestive tract. But the most dramatic trade-off, the one that nearly broke the whole system, was the obstetric dilemma. And this is where evolution really painted itself into a corner. See, humans walk upright. We've been doing it for millions of years. It's one of our defining characteristics. But walking upright requires a specific pelvic structure. Your pelvis has to be relatively narrow to allow efficient bipedal locomotion. Make it too wide and you can't walk properly. You'd waddle like a duck, wasting energy with every step. Now add the giant brain problem. Human babies need to be born with heads big enough to house brains that will eventually consume 20% of the body's energy budget. But those big heads have to fit through a narrow pelvis designed for efficient walking. Evolution's solution was brutal. Human babies are born essentially premature compared to other primates. A baby horse can walk within hours of birth. A baby antelope can run from predators within days. Even baby chimps are far more developed than human infants. They can cling to their mothers, support their own heads, move around independently. Human babies, completely helpless, can't walk, can't cling, can't even hold their heads up. For the first year of life, they're basically immobile. For several years after that, they remain dependent in ways that would be fatal for any other species. This creates an enormous problem. A human infant is a massive liability. It can't escape predators, can't gather its own food, can't do anything but eat, sleep, and cry. It requires constant attention from adults who could be doing other important survival tasks, and this dependency lasts not for months but for years. Human children don't reach anything like independence until they're at least 10 or 12 years old. By primate standards, this is insane. The metabolic math gets even more brutal during pregnancy and early childhood. A pregnant woman's energy requirements increase by maybe 300 calories per day, not terrible. But after birth, nursing an infant requires an additional 500 calories per day. And during the infant's rapid brain development in the first few years, they're consuming resources at a rate that would bankrupt most other species. How did humans survive with these massive disadvantages? The answer is the same thing that got us through the bottleneck: social cooperation. Humans developed something almost no other species has: cooperative breeding. In most mammals, mothers raise their offspring alone or maybe with a mate's help. In humans, child rearing became a community activity. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated members of the group helped care for infants. This distributed the enormous cost of raising these helpless, big-brained babies across multiple adults. We also developed pair bonding and paternal investment unusual among primates. Human fathers, at least in most cultures throughout history, have invested significant time and resources in their children. This helped offset the enormous metabolic cost of those big brains. And we developed extended childhood specifically designed to fill those big brains with information. Human children don't become independent at age 5 or 6 like most primates. They spend 15 or 20 years learning, accumulating knowledge, developing skills. This extended learning period was only possible because of complex social structures that could support dependent juveniles for decades. In other words, we traded physical capabilities for intelligence, then used that intelligence to create social systems that compensated for our physical weaknesses. Humans became obligately cooperative. We literally cannot survive without complex social groups. A single human, or even a nuclear family in the ancestral environment, would have died quickly. We needed tribes, communities, networks of mutual support. But here's the really fascinating part. Around 50,000 years ago, our brain stopped growing. For the last 50,000 years, human brain size has been essentially stable. In some populations, it's actually decreased slightly. Why did the expansion stop? The answer is that we'd hit the optimal size, the sweet spot where the benefits of additional intelligence were balanced by the costs of an even more energy-hungry brain, and the physical limitations of giving birth through a pelvis designed for bipedalism. Think about it this way. If bigger brains were always better, evolution would have kept making them bigger. But there's a point where the costs exceed the benefits. Every additional cubic centimetre of brain tissue requires more energy, makes birth more dangerous, and increases infant dependency. At some point, probably around 50,000 years ago, humans reached the size where adding more brain tissue would cause more problems than it solved. The pelvic opening simply couldn't get any wider without compromising efficient walking. Infants couldn't be born any more premature without becoming completely unviable, and brains couldn't demand much more than 20% of the body's energy budget without causing serious metabolic problems. So evolution stopped, not because it ran out of variations to select for, not because there was no pressure for greater intelligence, but because the physical constraints of the human body had reached their limit. And once that happened, something remarkable occurred. With brain size locked in, and with the body already optimized to support that massive energy-hungry organ, there was no room for other major physical changes. Every system in the human body had been reconfigured around one goal: supporting a brain that could think, plan, innovate, and communicate at unprecedented levels. Want stronger muscles? Sorry, the brain needs those calories. Want faster running speed? Can't spare the energy. Want better climbing abilities, sharper claws, bigger teeth? All of that requires resources that are already allocated to keeping that 3-pound supercomputer in your skull running at full capacity. This is why human physical evolution essentially stopped 50,000 years ago. Not because we'd become perfect, not because natural selection stopped working, but because we'd made a trade-off that locked in every other aspect of our anatomy. The human body became a life support system for the brain. Everything else, every other physical characteristic, was either optimized to support brain function or was minimized to free up resources for it. We became the species that sacrificed everything for intelligence, and it worked. Those big brains let us develop language sophisticated enough to share complex information across generations. They let us create tools that compensated for our physical weaknesses. They let us develop social structures that turned our helplessness into a strength, making us dependent on each other in ways that created powerful cooperative bonds. They let us master fire, which pre-digested our food and freed up even more energy for our brains. They let us develop clothing and shelter, which meant we didn't need to evolve thick fur or other climate adaptations. They let us create weapons that made us dangerous despite our physical weakness. In short, those energy-hungry, birth-complicating, infant-weakening brains made us human. And once we had them, once we'd paid the enormous physical price for intelligence, there was no going back. No room for further physical evolution because the trade-off was complete. We'd become the species that thinks its way out of problems instead of evolving physical solutions. And that choice, made gradually over millions of years but essentially locked in by 50,000 years ago, is why humans stopped changing physically. The brain won. Everything else became negotiable. Here's what happened next and why it changed everything about our evolutionary story. So you've got these 3 human species, modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, all descended from those bottleneck survivors, all spreading across the world. Logic says they should have kept diverging, right? Kept evolving in different directions until they became completely separate species that could no longer interbreed. That's how speciation normally works. You isolate populations, give them different environments, wait a few 100,000 years, and boom, you get new species. Except, that's not what happened. Not even close. Instead, between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, something unprecedented occurred. The descendants of those African survivors, the ones who had become fully modern humans, began the greatest migration in our species' history. And this migration did something that no other animal migration had ever done. It prevented speciation. It locked our physical form in place. It made us, for all practical purposes, the species that stopped evolving. Let me explain how this worked. Around 70,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans, maybe just a few hundred individuals, left Africa. We know this because every non-African human alive today carries genetic markers from this single exodus. Your ancestors, my ancestors, everyone whose family didn't stay in Africa, we're all descended from that one small group of adventurous migrants. They crossed the Red Sea, probably during a period when sea levels were lower and the crossing was easier. Some researchers think they walked across, others think they used simple rafts. Either way, they made it to the Arabian Peninsula, and then they just kept going. Within a few thousand years, which is basically a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, they had spread across the Middle East. Within 10,000 years, they had reached India, Southeast Asia, and Australia. By 40,000 years ago, they were in Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas. This was migration on a scale that had never happened before. Not just one group moving to one new location, but continuous waves of humans spreading in every direction, occupying every possible habitat from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. And here's the crucial part. They never stopped moving. Even after reaching these distant territories, human populations remained mobile. Archaeological evidence shows people trading materials over hundreds of miles, obsidian from volcanic sources showing up in sites hundreds of kilometers away, seashells from the coast found in inland settlements, specific types of stone tools spreading across entire continents in just a few generations. This constant movement meant something profound for human evolution. It meant that isolated populations never stayed isolated long enough to diverge significantly. Think about it like this. You've got one group that settles in coastal Southeast Asia. They start adapting to that environment, getting better at fishing, maybe developing slightly different physical traits. But before they can diverge too much from the main human population, another wave of migrants arrives from inland. They interbreed. Genes get mixed. Any unique mutations that might have been developing in the coastal group get diluted by the new arrivals. Then some of the coastal people migrate further east, carrying their genes to new populations. Meanwhile, traders arrive from India, bringing genes from populations that stayed closer to Africa. It's a constant churning, mixing and remixing of genetic material. Geneticists call this gene flow. And in human populations, gene flow was happening at a rate that was completely unprecedented in evolutionary history. Most animal species have fairly stable territories. A population of wolves occupies a specific range. A group of gorillas lives in a particular forest. They might expand or contract based on environmental conditions, but generally they stay put for many generations. This allows isolated populations to develop unique characteristics over time. Humans didn't do that. We were always on the move, always trading, always encountering new groups, always interbreeding. The archaeological record shows this mobility accelerating over time. By 50,000 years ago, you can track specific cultural innovations spreading across thousands of miles in just centuries. A new type of stone blade technology appears in the Middle East and shows up in Europe 2,000 years later. A distinctive style of decorative beads emerges in Africa and appears in Asia a few thousand years after that. These weren't just ideas spreading. They were people moving, carrying their genes and their culture with them, creating a worldwide network of genetic exchange that kept all human populations connected. But it wasn't just modern humans moving around. They were also encountering those other human species, the Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, the Denisovans in Eastern Asia. And here's where the story gets really interesting. They interbred. We know this because every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA. About 1 to 2% of your genome, if your ancestors left Africa, comes from Neanderthals. People of Asian descent carry additional Denisovan DNA. Some populations in Melanesia and Australia carry as much as 5% Denisovan genetic material. This interbreeding should have created even more diversity, right? Different populations mixing with Neanderthals and Denisovans at different rates, picking up different genes, diverging even further. But here's what actually happened. Those Neanderthal and Denisovan genes got mixed right back into the main human gene pool. A group of modern humans meets Neanderthals in the Middle East 50,000 years ago. They interbreed. Some offspring inherit Neanderthal genes that help them survive cold climates. But then those individuals migrate further, interbreeding with other modern human groups. The Neanderthal genes get diluted, spread out, mixed throughout the entire expanding population. It's like dropping a handful of different coloured marbles into a giant mixing machine that never stops turning. Eventually all the colours blend together. You don't get separate new colours concentrating in different areas. You get a uniform mixture everywhere. The genetic evidence for this is remarkable. Despite spreading across the entire world, despite encountering wildly different environments, despite mixing with other human species, modern humans remained genetically homogeneous. Remarkably, almost impossibly similar to each other. Two modern humans from opposite ends of the earth, one from South Africa and one from northern Siberia, are more genetically similar to each other than two chimpanzees from neighbouring forests in Africa. Think about that. Chimpanzees who live 50 miles apart are more genetically different from each other than humans who live on different continents. This genetic similarity exists because the gene flow never stopped. Even populations that seemed isolated maintained contact with their neighbours, and those neighbours had neighbours. And through this chain of connections, genes flowed from one end of the human range to the other. Anthropologists call this a ring species pattern, but on a global scale. No single group could talk to every other group, but everyone was connected through chains of intermediate populations. A genetic innovation in Africa could, over a few thousand years, spread all the way to Australia through this network of connections. The really wild part is what happened to the groups that tried to remain isolated. There's genetic evidence of populations that attempted to separate themselves, maybe living on islands or in particularly remote locations, and almost without exception, these groups either died out or eventually reconnected with the main human network. There's evidence of a human population that reached the Philippines around 50,000 years ago and remained isolated for thousands of years. But eventually they either went extinct or were absorbed by new waves of migrants. Their genes didn't diverge enough to create a separate species. The isolation wasn't long enough. The only way to create new human species would have been complete isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. And human mobility made that impossible. There was nowhere on Earth remote enough that humans wouldn't eventually reach it and bring their genes with them. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something happened that should have changed everything. Agriculture. Humans started settling down, building permanent villages, staying in one place for generations. You'd think this would finally allow isolated populations to diverge. But instead, it had the opposite effect. Agriculture created population explosions. Villages turned into towns. Towns turned into cities. And with these larger populations came more trade, more movement, more genetic mixing than ever before. A farming village in Mesopotamia 8,000 years ago might have seemed isolated, but it was trading grain with the next village, and that village was trading with another. Networks of trade and exchange expanded rapidly with agriculture, and wherever goods travelled, genes travelled too. Merchants moving between cities, armies conquering new territories and interbreeding with local populations, marriage alliances between different groups. Agricultural expansion meant more genetic mixing, not less. The genetic evidence shows this clearly. After the agricultural revolution, gene flow between human populations actually accelerated. Mutations that appeared in one population spread to others faster than ever before. The invention of writing, the development of long-distance trade routes, the rise of empires, all of it increased human mobility and genetic exchange. By 3,000 years ago, you had trade networks spanning entire continents. The Silk Road connected Asia and Europe. Maritime routes linked coastal populations across vast distances. People were moving and interbreeding at rates that made speciation completely impossible. Even populations that lived in extreme environments, places that should have selected for specific physical adaptations, remained fundamentally human. Groups that migrated to the Arctic developed cultural adaptations for surviving extreme cold, better clothing, more efficient shelters, sophisticated hunting techniques. But physically, they remained nearly identical to humans living in tropical regions. Yes, there were some changes. Populations in northern latitudes developed lighter skin to synthesize vitamin D more efficiently in low-light conditions. Some groups developed genetic adaptations to high altitude or to digest specific foods. But these were tiny tweaks, surface-level modifications, nothing that would prevent them from interbreeding successfully with any other human population. That's the key point. Gene flow kept all human populations interfertile. We never separated long enough for reproductive barriers to develop. A person from any human population could meet a person from any other human population and produce healthy, fertile offspring. We were one species, kept unified by constant movement and mixing. Compare this to what happened with other animal species. Polar bears and grizzly bears separated just 150,000 years ago. They're now distinct species that only occasionally interbreed in narrow contact zones. Modern humans and Neanderthals had been separated for over 500,000 years, yet we could still interbreed successfully when we met. The difference was gene flow. Neanderthals lived in relatively small, isolated populations in Europe. Modern humans lived in large, interconnected populations that were constantly exchanging genes. Neanderthals kept evolving in their specific direction. Modern humans stopped evolving in any direction because gene flow kept pulling every population back toward the average. By 50,000 years ago, this pattern was locked in place. Human populations were too mobile, too interconnected, too constantly mixing for significant physical divergence to occur. We had become the species that conquered speciation itself, not through biological adaptation, but through social and technological innovation. Our ability to communicate, trade, and maintain relationships across vast distances meant that we would remain one species, forever traveling, forever mixing, forever human. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. All those incredible adaptations, all that relentless natural selection that had been shaping human bodies for millions of years, it was about to grind to a halt. Not because we went extinct, not because we stopped evolving entirely, but because we did something no other species in Earth's history had ever managed. We reversed the fundamental equation of evolution. For every other animal on the planet, evolution works the same way. Environment presents challenges. Organisms adapt or die. The environment is always in control, always selecting which traits succeed and which traits disappear. But around 50,000 years ago, humans figured out how to flip that script. We stopped adapting to the environment. Instead, we made the environment adapt to us. Think about what this means. For 3.5 billion years, life on Earth played by one set of rules. If it's cold, evolve thick fur. If it's hot, evolve better cooling systems. If predators hunt you, evolve speed or camouflage or defensive weapons. Natural selection operating exactly the same way across every species, every ecosystem, every environment. Then humans come along and break the game entirely. The shift started subtly. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was thousands of small innovations accumulating over millennia, each one slightly reducing the pressure of natural selection, each one creating a tiny buffer between human bodies and environmental pressures. Eventually, those buffers added up to something revolutionary. Consider predation first. For most of human evolutionary history, we were prey, not apex predators, not masters of the food chain, just another medium-sized mammal trying not to get eaten. Big cats, hyenas, crocodiles, even large eagles, they all saw early humans as potential meals. The fossil record is brutal on this point. We found ancient human skulls with puncture marks matching leopard fangs, bones with bite patterns from hyenas, evidence that for millions of years humans were food. This created intense selective pressure. Humans who could spot predators faster, react quicker, coordinate better with their group, they survived. Those who couldn't became lunch. Generation after generation, natural selection refined our threat detection systems, our startle reflexes, our ability to recognize danger patterns. Your ancestors were prey animals, and your brain still carries the adaptations that kept them alive. But then something changed. Humans started living in larger groups, not just family units of 5 or 10, but bands of 30, 50, even 100 individuals. Suddenly predators faced a very different calculation. A lone human, easy prey. A group of 50 humans armed with spears and rocks and coordinated defensive strategies. That's not prey anymore. That's dangerous. Archaeological evidence from around 70,000 years ago shows a dramatic shift. Human campsites start showing fewer signs of predator attacks. Bones stop displaying the characteristic damage patterns of carnivore feeding. By 50,000 years ago, humans had essentially removed themselves from the menu, not through physical evolution. Our bodies hadn't gotten faster or stronger, we'd gotten smarter and more social. The selective pressure that had been shaping human defensive capabilities for millions of years simply vanished. Being able to outrun a lion no longer mattered, because you had 49 friends with spears standing between you and the lion. Having sharp instincts for danger still helped, but it wasn't life or death anymore, not the way it had been for your ancestors. Then there's food security. For most animals, starvation is the ultimate selective pressure. Years of drought. The individuals who can survive on less food make it through. Everyone else dies. Harsh winters. Those with the most efficient metabolisms, the best fat storage, they're the ones who see spring. Natural selection operating at maximum intensity. Culling anyone whose body isn't perfectly optimized for food scarcity. Early humans faced this pressure constantly. The genetic evidence is clear. We evolved incredible metabolic flexibility, bodies that could switch between feast and famine modes, store fat efficiently when food was available, survive extended periods of near starvation. These are adaptations carved by millions of years of hunger. But then humans developed systematic hunting techniques, not just opportunistic scavenging, not just taking whatever they could find, but planned, coordinated hunting strategies that could bring down massive animals, mammoths, giant bison, entire herds of reindeer. A single successful mammoth hunt could feed a band of humans for weeks, maybe months if they could preserve the meat properly, and they could preserve it. because they'd also mastered fire. Humans learned they could smoke meat, drying it over low flames until it would last through entire seasons. They figured out that winter itself could be a preservation tool, keeping meat frozen in natural ice caves. They developed elaborate food storage systems, hiding caches of dried meat and processed nuts in locations they could return to when times got tough. By 50,000 years ago, human groups had achieved something unprecedented. Food security. Not perfect, not all the time, but regular enough that starvation stopped being the primary selector of human traits. You didn't need the absolute most efficient metabolism anymore. You didn't need to be the best at surviving famine. You needed to be good at hunting coordination, good at remembering where food caches were hidden, good at maintaining the social relationships that ensured you got your share of the group's resources. Survival had shifted from physical optimization to social and cognitive skills. Your body mattered less. Your brain and your relationships mattered more. Climate is another massive factor. Temperature extremes have driven evolution for billions of years. Can't survive the cold, your lineage ends. Can't handle the heat, your genes don't make it to the next generation. This is basic evolutionary biology. Environmental temperature is one of the most powerful selective forces on the planet. Except humans figured out how to control temperature. Not on a planetary scale, not yet, but in the immediate environment around their bodies. Fire wasn't just for cooking and scaring away predators. It was portable climate control. A campfire could turn a freezing night into a comfortable sleeping environment. Humans could venture into territories that should have been uninhabitable, carrying their climate with them in the form of controlled flame. Then they added clothing, animal, skins carefully prepared and sewn together, creating artificial insulation far more effective than any amount of body hair. Humans colonized the frozen steppes of Ice Age Europe, wearing tailored fur garments that kept them warmer than any biological adaptation could have managed. When they moved into tropical environments, they wore lighter clothing or nothing at all, adapting their technology to local conditions while their bodies remained essentially unchanged. Shelter added another layer of climate control, not just natural caves anymore. Constructed dwellings designed to maximize warmth in winter and cooling in summer. Humans in the Arctic built insulated homes partially underground. Humans in deserts created structures that used evaporative cooling and strategic ventilation. Every environment presented challenges, and humans met each challenge with technology rather than biological adaptation. The selective pressure that should have been creating distinct cold-adapted and heat-adapted human subspecies just disappeared. Your body didn't need to change because you could change your immediate environment instead. The humans who colonized northern Europe didn't evolve thick fur, they made clothing. The humans who moved into tropical rainforests didn't evolve better cooling systems, they built appropriate shelters. But perhaps the most revolutionary change was social care. In every other animal species, survival of the fittest operates ruthlessly. Get injured, you're probably going to die. Get sick. Natural selection is about to remove you from the gene pool, born with a physical disability. Your chances of passing on your genes are essentially zero. This is how evolution is supposed to work. Harsh, unforgiving, constantly culling any individual who isn't perfectly optimized for survival. The genes of the strong, healthy, and lucky move forward. Everyone else's genes disappear. Humans broke this system too. Archaeological evidence from 50,000 years ago shows something remarkable. Skeletons of individuals who survived serious injuries, broken legs that healed, infections that were nursed through. people living into old age despite disabilities that would have been death sentences for any other animal. There's even evidence of humans surviving serious brain injuries, injuries that would have left them partially disabled and completely dependent on group care for months or years. This is the smoking gun, proof that humans were caring for each other, feeding individuals who couldn't feed themselves, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, keeping alive members of the group whose genetic fitness, in traditional evolutionary terms, was compromised. Your ancestors started looking after each other, and when they did, they fundamentally altered the selective pressures shaping human evolution. Suddenly, having the strongest body wasn't the only way to survive. Being able to form strong social bonds mattered just as much. Being valuable to the group in non-physical ways, as a storyteller, a toolmaker, a keeper of knowledge, could compensate for physical limitations. The selective landscape had changed completely. Then there's sexual selection, which often drives physical evolution even faster than environmental pressures. In most species, males compete violently for access to females. The biggest, strongest, most aggressive males get to breed. Everyone else's genes die out. This creates runaway selection for size, strength, and competitive ability. It's why male gorillas are twice the size of females, why elephant seals have those massive bodies and aggressive behaviors, sexual selection in action. Early human evolution probably worked this way too. Larger, stronger males likely had better reproductive success. But something changed. Humans developed pair bonding. Not just temporary mating, not just dominant males controlling harems, but long-term partnerships between individual men and women who stayed together, raised children together, invested in each other's survival. This fundamentally altered sexual selection pressures. In a pair bonding species, females aren't just looking for the strongest male. They're looking for partners who will stick around, provide resources, help raise children. Males who can hunt effectively, share resources, maintain social relationships, form protective alliances. These males suddenly have reproductive advantages that have nothing to do with their physical strength or size. The archaeological record shows the results. Starting around 50,000 years ago, human sexual dimorphism begins to decrease. Males and females become more similar in size and build. This is the signature of reduced male-male competition and increased partner choice. Human females were selecting mates based on a complex mix of traits, not just physical dominance, and human males who could succeed through cooperation and social skills rather than just strength and aggression were passing on their genes. All these factors, predation pressure eliminated, starvation reduced, climate controlled, social care protecting the vulnerable, sexual selection shifted away from pure physicality. They combined to create an environment where the old rules of natural selection barely applied anymore. The humans who succeeded weren't necessarily the ones with the most optimized bodies. They were the ones with the best tools, the strongest social networks, the most extensive knowledge, the most useful skills. Your ancestors created a bubble of environmental stability around themselves, a human-made ecosystem where intelligence, social ability, and cultural knowledge mattered more than physical adaptations, where survival depended more on what you knew than what your body could do, where evolution itself began to slow down because the pressures that drive physical change had been, at least partially, neutralized. This was the beginning of the end for human physical evolution, not because we stopped evolving entirely, but because we'd created conditions where our bodies no longer needed to change. We'd found a different way to adapt, faster, more flexible, infinitely more powerful than waiting for genetic mutations. We adapted through culture, through technology, through accumulated knowledge passed down and built upon generation after generation. We'd become the species that evolved to stop evolving, at least physically. But what was still changing? What aspects of human biology were continuing to adapt? The answer might surprise you. Now, before you think this entire story means we're frozen in evolutionary amber, completely unchanging since our ancestors left Africa, we need to talk about what's actually still happening. Because here's the thing, evolution hasn't stopped. Not even close. It's just that the changes occurring over the last 50,000 years are so subtle, so minor compared to what came before, that calling them evolutionary changes almost feels like an overstatement. Think of it this way. The difference between Homo erectus and modern humans, that's like comparing a bicycle to a motorcycle. Completely different machines, different capabilities, different everything. But the changes happening over the last 50,000 years, that's like comparing a 2020 motorcycle to a 2024 model. Sure, there are improvements, refinements, tweaks to the design. But fundamentally, you're looking at the same machine. So what's actually changing? Let's start with the most famous example, one that shows up in almost every discussion of recent human evolution. Lactose tolerance. 10,000 years ago, virtually no adult humans could digest milk. None. Doesn't matter where they lived, what their ancestry was. After weaning, the gene that produces lactase, the enzyme that breaks down milk sugar, would shut off. Drinking milk as an adult would give you cramps, diarrhea, all the unpleasant symptoms we now associate with lactose intolerance. But lactose intolerance wasn't the condition back then, it was the default, the normal human state. Then something changed. Around 10,000 years ago, in several different populations that had begun practicing dairy farming, mutations appeared that kept the lactase gene switched on into adulthood. These mutations weren't the same in different populations. European lactose tolerance comes from one genetic variant. African and Middle Eastern versions come from different mutations entirely, but they all do the same thing: let adults digest milk. And the selective advantage was enormous. In societies that raised cattle, sheep, or goats, being able to drink milk meant access to a reliable protein source without having to kill the animal. It meant children could be weaned earlier, allowing mothers to have more babies. It meant better nutrition during famines when crops failed but livestock survived. Within just a few thousand years, which is incredibly fast in evolutionary terms, the lactose tolerance mutation spread through dairy farming populations. Today, over 80% of Northern Europeans carry the mutation. But in populations without a history of dairy farming, East Asians, Native Americans, most Africans, lactose intolerance remains the norm. This is evolution happening in recorded human history. Real genetic change driven by natural selection in response to cultural innovation. And it's not the only example. Take high-altitude adaptations. Humans have been living in the Himalayas and Andes for thousands of years. But these aren't just lowlanders toughing it out in thin air. They've actually evolved genetic differences that help them survive at elevations that would incapacitate most people. Tibetan populations carry a gene variant called EPAS1 that changes how their bodies respond to low oxygen. Instead of producing excess red blood cells, which is what lowlanders do when they spend time at altitude, Tibetans maintain normal red blood cell counts while still getting enough oxygen to their tissues. This prevents altitude sickness and all the cardiovascular problems that come with having blood that's too thick. And here's the wild part. That EPAS1 variant, it came from Denisovans, remember them? The mysterious human species that spread across Asia after the bottleneck, When modern humans and denisovans interbred tens of thousands of years ago, some of our ancestors picked up this high-altitude gene. Most populations lost it because it provided no advantage at sea level. But in Tibet, where altitude is a constant challenge, natural selection strongly favoured anyone who carried the Denisovan variant. Today, something like 87% of Tibetans carry it. That's evolution through interbreeding and subsequent natural selection, all happening within the last 30,000 years. Then there's disease resistance. This one gets dark fast, but it's important. Throughout human history, infectious diseases have been massive selective pressures. Populations that lived in dense agricultural settlements faced different diseases than nomadic hunter-gatherers, and those diseases left genetic signatures. The most famous example is the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, common in European populations. People with this mutation are resistant to HIV because the virus can't attach to their cells properly. But this mutation didn't evolve in response to HIV. It's been around for at least 1,000 years, possibly longer. Most researchers think it spread because it provided resistance to bubonic plague or smallpox, diseases that devastated European populations repeatedly throughout history. The fact that it also provides HIV resistance is just a coincidence, a lucky accident of genetic history. But it shows how disease pressure can drive rapid evolutionary change in human populations. And if you look at genetic differences between populations today, disease resistance genes show up again and again. Malaria resistance in African and Mediterranean populations, tuberculosis resistance in Europeans, different immune system variants optimized for different pathogen environments. These are real evolutionary changes, genetic differences between populations driven by natural selection, operating over hundreds of generations. But notice something. None of these changes alter the basic human body plan. They're metabolic tweaks, immune system adjustments, biochemical refinements. Important for survival, yes, but not the kind of dramatic physical transformations that characterized earlier human evolution. You want to see an evolutionary change that actually shows up when you look at someone? Let's talk about blue eyes. 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, a single individual somewhere near the Black Sea was born with a mutation in the OCA2 gene. This mutation didn't eliminate pigment production entirely, but it dramatically reduced melanin in the iris. The result? Blue eyes. Before this mutation appeared, every human on Earth had brown eyes. Dark brown, light brown, maybe hazel. But blue didn't exist. That original blue-eyed individual passed the mutation to their children. And then something interesting happened. The mutation spread fast. Today, roughly 8 to 10% of the world's population has blue eyes, and they all descended from that single ancestor 10,000 years ago. Genetic analysis proves it. Every blue-eyed person on Earth shares the exact same mutation. But why did it spread? Blue eyes provide no survival advantage. If anything, they're slightly disadvantageous in sunny climates because they offer less protection from UV radiation. So why did they persist and proliferate? Most anthropologists think sexual selection. People found blue eyes attractive, novel, distinctive, and in small populations where everyone knew everyone else, having a rare trait made you memorable. Maybe it made you more desirable as a mate. Over hundreds of generations, this preference was enough to spread the mutation from one person to hundreds of millions. That's evolution driven not by survival pressure, but by mate choice. Still natural selection, just a different kind, and it created a visible physical change that appeared entirely within recorded human history. Then there's stuff that's happening right now, changes so recent we can track them in real time. Wisdom teeth, for example. More and more people are being born without wisdom teeth, or with wisdom teeth that never fully develop. Some researchers estimate that 35% of the global population now lacks at least one wisdom tooth. Why? Probably because we don't need them anymore. Modern humans have smaller jaws than our ancestors, probably due to softer processed foods that don't require as much chewing. Wisdom teeth, which once helped grind tough plant materials and raw meat, now mostly just cause problems, getting impacted, requiring extraction. There's no strong selective pressure against wisdom teeth. We live long enough to reproduce whether we have them or not. But there might be a slight advantage to not developing them. Fewer dental problems, less pain, lower risk of infections. Over many generations, that tiny advantage adds up. Not quickly, but measurably. Other minor changes are happening too. Average height has increased in most populations over the last few centuries, though this is mostly environmental, better nutrition, not genetic change. Skull shape has shifted slightly in some populations, becoming less robust, more graceful. Some researchers report changes in hand proportions related to fine motor skill demands. But here's what you need to understand about all these changes. They're microevolution. Tiny adjustments to systems that are already in place. They're not creating new structures or capabilities. They're fine-tuning existing ones. Compare this to what happened between 2 million years ago and 200,000 years ago. Brain size tripled. Body proportions changed dramatically. Vocal anatomy was completely restructured. Skeletal structure was rebuilt from the ground up. These weren't adjustments, they were transformations, and there's a reason for the difference. Time. 50,000 years seems like forever from a human perspective. It's longer than recorded history by a factor of 10. It spans the entire development of agriculture, civilization, written language, everything we think of as human achievement. But in evolutionary terms, 50,000 years is nothing. A blip, a rounding error. Major evolutionary changes, the kind that alter body plans and create new species, typically require hundreds of thousands of years, often millions. They require consistent directional selection pressure, generation after generation, favoring certain traits over others. Even with strong selection pressure, the kind that produces noticeable change in just a few thousand years like lactose tolerance, you're still just modifying existing genes, tweaking regulatory sequences, adjusting when and where genes turn on and off, creating entirely new structures, new capabilities. That requires accumulating multiple mutations in just the right sequence, with each step providing enough advantage to spread through the population before the next mutation appears. It requires lucky accidents, genetic drift, population bottlenecks, geographic isolation, all the messy, complicated factors that drive macroevolution. And it requires time, lots of time, more time than humans have had since we became fully modern. So when people ask whether humans will keep evolving, the answer is yes, absolutely. We're evolving right now. Mutations are appearing, spreading, being selected for or against based on reproductive success. Future humans 10,000 years from now will probably have slightly different genetic profiles than us. Maybe more lactose tolerance in currently intolerant populations. Maybe different immune system variants as new diseases appear. Maybe shifts in metabolic efficiency as diets change. But will they look fundamentally different? Will they have different body structures, new capabilities, altered anatomies? Almost certainly not. Not unless something dramatic changes. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the factors that stabilized human physical evolution 50,000 years ago, culture, technology, migration, environmental modification, they're not weakening, they're getting stronger. Modern medicine eliminates many selective pressures that once shaped human evolution. Genetic conditions that would have been fatal 10,000 years ago are now survivable, even curable. Individuals who wouldn't have reproduced in ancient environments now have children who carry their genes forward. This isn't stopping evolution, it's changing what traits get selected for. But it's also further reducing any pressure for major physical change. Global migration and interbreeding are accelerating. Geographic isolation, one of the key factors in speciation, is essentially impossible now. Humans from different continents meet, marry, have children. Any genetic variants that appear in one population can spread to others within generations, and our technology keeps improving our ability to modify our environment rather than adapting to it. Too cold? We build heated shelters. Too hot? Air conditioning, high altitude, supplemental oxygen. We engineer solutions faster than evolution could possibly adapt our bodies. Some futurists speculate about directed human evolution, using genetic engineering to make changes that natural selection never would. Enhanced intelligence, disease resistance, longevity. But that's not evolution anymore, not in the biological sense. That's design. Real evolution, natural selection operating on random mutations across generations, is still happening, still creating subtle changes in human populations. But the age of major human physical evolution, that ended 50,000 years ago when we became smart enough to change our environment instead of letting it change us. We're not frozen, we're not done. We're just no longer changing in ways that would make us look different if you could see us all lined up, generation by generation, stretching back to the beginning. The motorcycle got refined, but it's still fundamentally a motorcycle, and it probably always will be. So here we are, 50,000 years later, physically almost identical to those ancestors who walked out of Africa. Same body structure, same brain size, same basic genetic blueprint. We've built cities that scrape the sky, split the atom, walked on the moon, and connected the entire planet with invisible networks of information. But our bodies, they're basically unchanged. This is the paradox that started our journey tonight. Why did we stop evolving physically when evolution never stops for any other species? Now you know the answer. It's not one reason. It's a perfect storm of factors that all converged at the same unique moment in our species' history. First, the bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near extinction didn't just reduce our numbers. They fundamentally changed how evolution works for humans. We lost the genetic diversity that fuels rapid physical change. Every human alive today is so genetically similar that we're all essentially cousins. There's just not enough variation for natural selection to work with. The raw material of evolution, the mutations and variations that drive physical change, they're scarce in our species. We're too alike, too uniform. The bottleneck saw to that. Second, culture replaced biology. Somewhere during or after that desperate struggle for survival, we made a trade. Instead of adapting our bodies to new environments, we adapted our tools, our clothing, our shelter, our social systems. Why spend 100,000 years evolving thicker fur when you can skin an animal and wear its hide? Why spend millennia developing stronger teeth when you can invent cooking? Every problem that would normally require a biological solution, we solved with culture instead. And culture evolves infinitely faster than genes. A good idea can spread across the entire human population in a single generation. A genetic adaptation takes thousands of years minimum. Third, the brain trade-off. That massive energy-hungry brain sitting in your skull, it's consuming 20% of your calories right now. Just existing, thinking, processing the words you're hearing. That kind of energy investment means there's nothing left over for other major physical modifications. Evolution gave us intelligence, and intelligence made everything else unnecessary. We became the species that thinks its way out of problems instead of growing its way out of them. Fourth, environmental control. We don't adapt to environments anymore. We create them. Humans live everywhere from the Arctic to the Sahara, not because we evolved different bodies for different climates, but because we brought our preferred environment with us. Fire, clothing, shelter, now heating and air conditioning. We've essentially frozen the selective pressures that would normally drive physical evolution. The environment can't shape us anymore because we've learned to shape it first. But here's the really profound part. We didn't just stop evolving physically. We became the first species in Earth's history to control its own evolution, not through genes, but through ideas. Every generation we pass down not just DNA, but knowledge, stories, technologies, ways of thinking. This cultural inheritance evolves and adapts far faster than biology ever could. We are shaped more by the ideas we inherit than the genes. We're the species that evolved to stop evolving, at least in the traditional sense. We found a better way, and that makes us unique in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. The species that learned to adapt through learning, that changed itself through culture, that reshaped the entire planet without fundamentally reshaping its own body. We are evolution's strangest product, the creature that became so good at adapting that it no longer needed to change. If you've made it this far into our journey tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a like if this story kept you company. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe if you want more explorations of the deep history that made us who we are. Now let that settle into your thoughts as you drift off. You are the descendant of survivors, the product of a crisis that almost destroyed our species, the inheritor of a genetic legacy refined by the worst conditions imaginable. And somehow, against all odds, you're still here, still human, still essentially unchanged for 50,000 years, because we became the species that didn't need to change anymore. We just needed to think, sleep well,